He began to realize very quickly, from 51 through 55, that there was going to be a huge cancer outbreak in the next 40, 50 years. If we do this, it's got to be you, because when this information comes out, I think there's going to be a lot of pissed off people. They're going to be really, really upset.
The shadowed truths of the 1950s, with polio as its tragic centerpiece, were never just about a virus. It was about control, narrative, and a legacy tied to FDR's prominence.
In the 1950s, the focus was on polio. And the reason it was on polio is because our president FDR got it. He was succumbing to it. He had a famous lawyer friend in New York who started the March of Dimes. You probably heard that. It was actually collecting dimes. All that research led to Jonas Salk and his vaccine. Have you ever wondered, anybody in the room, why Jonas Salk never won a Nobel Prize?
The Qatar event, wiped clean from medical history, stands as a glaring reminder of how truths inconvenient to the establishment are erased with surgical precision.
There's a reason. It's called the Qatar event. And you may not know about the Qatar event. The reason why it's been scrubbed from the annals of medicine, it's also been scrubbed from medical textbooks. It's also scrubbed from the FDA website. But see, I'm an old guy. I trained at a time before cancer culture, and I learned about this in medical school. Basically what they did, Jonas Salk was tied to a pharmaceutical company called Qatar Pharmaceuticals, and this is, remember, 1951. We didn't discover DNA until 1953 with Watson and Crick.
African green monkeys, unwitting participants in the race for a vaccine, symbolize how desperation often overshadows ethical considerations in science's darkest corridors.
They used African green monkeys to grow the polio virus on to make the vaccine. The vaccine was made and it was ready to be tested in 1950 and 1951. At the same time, a researcher named Dr. Bernice Eddy, who you probably also don't know because she was really the first doctor that was canceled. She did some testing on before it was given to humans, and she injected it into monkeys, and every single monkey got polio.
African green monkeys, unwitting participants in the race for a vaccine, symbolize how desperation often overshadows ethical considerations in science's darkest corridors.
This caused a big stir. Dr. Ochsner, who is running this program with the help of the federal government, he actually worked for the FBI and the CIA at this time, was so adamant that he took his grandchild, a female and male, in the amphitheater of Tulane Medical School down on Carrollton Avenue in New Orleans, place that I did my residency at. I've been in this amphitheater multiple times. And he injected both of his grandchildren. His grandchild, the male, in 2 days, and the granddaughter got a mild version of polio. It was at that time that people realized there was a big problem. But the bigger problem came when Bernice Eddy started to look into this. She found out that there was multiple viruses that were grown in the polio vaccine that went out, and 120 million people in the world from 51 through about 55 and 56 got this. The one that you guys may have heard of, because it's been in the news a lot, is something called SV40. What does SV stand for? Simian virus 40. That tells you there was 39 others, but Simian virus 40 is important. And African green monkeys have this virus in them. It is in them, doesn't bother them at all. They don't get any problems. But when you take SV40 out of any African green monkey and put it in any other animal, they always get soft tissue cancers, 100% guaranteed. So Dr. Ochsner, as I told you, was the first National Cancer Society president. He began to realize very quickly, from 51 through 55, that there was going to be a huge cancer outbreak in the next 40, 50 years.
By 1971, America wasn't just innovating medicine. It was engineering bioweapons, blurring the lines between national defense and global health compromise.
I need to find out what happened with that monkey virus. So it turns out in 1971, the monkey virus research went to Fort Detrick. If any of you see the black sheep of the Kennedy family up there, he just wrote the takedown book for Dr. Anthony Fauci. In that book, you'll see all the links to Fort Detrick. From 1971 all the way up to the Patriot Act, when they knocked the Twin Towers down, all of our biologic weapon stuff was done in the United States. Ironically, several viruses got out when Obama was president. Obama shut down the bioweapons program. And guess what he told Dr. Fauci to do? Go offshore. And guess where he went? Wuhan. So, gain of function research continued. Now, this is one of my members, okay? He pays me to make sure that I'm protecting him and his family. On July 4th, 2020, I had 100 members at my house. I told them there'll be no American flag. And I'm going to tell you two things. We're going to talk about two things: decentralized medicine and decentralized money. I said, make sure you buy Bitcoin. At the time, it was about 7-8 grand. I said, but make sure when they come out with this vaccine that you never take it. And I warned them then, we're talking 3 years ago, that I think there's a pretty good chance that you're going to find out in a messenger RNA vaccine, we're going to find DNA plasmids that are not supposed to be there. And we're probably also going to find out that SV40 is contaminating the viruses.
Kevin McKiernan's revelation of SV40 and DNA plasmids in Pfizer's vials lays bare a chilling narrative. What they've hidden, we must uncover.
I never talked about this publicly, ever. Why? Because I'm a little bit smarter than probably I am right now. The virus comes out. You guys can have whatever ideology you feel about it. I think you probably know what mine is. But the real story breaks about 2 months ago. 2 months ago, and you should write this name down because you need to follow him on Twitter. His name is Kevin McKiernan. He worked on the Human Genome Project for Craig Ventnor. So he's got serious chops in molecular biology. And he now works in the cannabis industry. And he decided to take Pfizer's vials and test them for those DNA plasmids and the SV40. And guess what he found? They're in there. So of course you can imagine when he posts this on Twitter, all the wackadoodles that, are pro-vax wanted to bury him. So one of those wackadoodles, also a very accomplished molecular biologist at the University of South Carolina, named Philip Buchholz, second name you want to write down and follow their Twitter account. He did the testing 4 weeks ago and confirmed that finding. So now, most of you, while you've been herbatizing and drinking and partying, you didn't know that the vaccine really was adulterated. And guess what? Needed a Bobby Kennedy. And I had an inkling that I was right. So I called my friend, Rick Rubin, because remember, he's the black sheep that is not cancelable because he's an awesome dude and everybody likes his music. I said, Rick, if we do this, it's got to be you, because when this information comes out, I think there's going to be a lot of pissed off people. They're going to be really, really upset.
COVID-19, a compliance drill masquerading as a pandemic, was the precursor to an engineered economic reset designed to consolidate global power.
How and why did this come? Well, it started from all these programs that I told you about in MK Ultra. And then the interesting thing is, just like this cyber pandemic that we just got through Microsoft, these are compliance tests for the next step. So I've told everybody very, very clearly that I felt it was a compliance test for a coming economic reset, which clearly is happening because money is failing. And the government needs us to be very compliant as the money fails so they go to the next step so they can maintain their control. Anybody who gets involved in that plan is taken out either by psychological warfare, a kinetic issue like you just saw with Trump, or an overthrow of a government. You saw what happened with the former prime minister of Japan when he pushed back on the people that are behind a lot of these ideas. And most of them are bureaucrats. A lot of people call them the deep state, but people don't realize where they all come from. And these guys are all highly coordinated. And they've been highly coordinated probably since 1947. And that idea, the whole idea of this revolution was actually started by General Kruse, who controlled the Manhattan Project. He felt that he was more important than the President of the United States, and he realized that the last true president had total control was FDR. And Truman was the Manchurian candidate, and the single most important thing that Kruse got done during Truman's early term was making sure in the executive order in 1947 that the CIA was formed.
The CIA, a perennial architect of chaos, has wielded influence not to empower, but to suppress and manipulate under the guise of national interest.
And the CIA, as far as I can tell, hasn't done anything for we the people. In fact, they've made our lives more miserable. They've been involved in things that actually are anti-we the people. It's pretty obvious, came out of Bobby Kennedy's own mouth, that he and his family believe that the CIA to his uncle and his father.
Yeah.
And, whether you're a Kennedy fan or not, the bottom line is when somebody's running for president now tells you that, you should kind of listen. They probably know more than you do. And, I've done podcasts with Bobby. I knew things that Bobby didn't even know. And I told him that these things are all related. And I personally believe part of the reason Trump did not release the JFK files, because he's also complicit with some of the people that were involved in that plot. And once he read what he read, he realized it. And then guess what? When you realize it, it doesn't take you too long to figure out why President Eisenhower in January of 61 gave that farewell speech and warned people what was being built for 13 years behind the scenes by the industrial military complex. It's basically a shadow government that can operate no matter who's the president, no matter who's in Congress, and they can do things to affect we the people so that they can run their forever. We call them today. The labels change with every decade, but the idea is the same. It's about control. It's about keeping your paradigm in power. It's about making sure people bend to your will. And when you understand this process, you begin to start to see it leak in other parts, of life, because you need to see it from the researcher side, and you also need to see it from the scientist side and the lawyer side. And that's why Marino's got a very interesting perspective, because he's got both. Because he tried to protect Becker, and when Becker realized that the government was the big problem, he didn't stop.
Silencing dissent isn't always with bullets. Defunding a lab or discrediting a voice achieves the same sinister goal as Trump's ordeal demonstrates.
He knew that his moral duty was to tell the truth, and they silenced him. Effectively, they silenced them not with acute lead toxicity like they just tried to do to Trump. They actually did it by defunding his lab. And that's where the idea of controlled demolition in science came from. They were successful in doing this with the polio vaccine and the NIH back then. That was the case that I laid out to Bobby on Rick Rubin's podcast. And some of the things that happened in that event, as hard as it is for people to believe, 75 years later, show up in the messenger RNA jabs, and you can actually see it in the contracts that the Department of Defense signed with Pfizer, and now that Pfizer turned around and signed with governments. Why? There's two legal definitions, and you knew that there had to be a reason for that. Well, over the last 4 years, we've kind of uncovered it through FOIA requests, through, podcasts that I've done, through I was in a documentary and raised this big issue when I read the original patents and looked at the legal definitions. I realized right away that in the aftermarket data, there would be evidence that would come out that would explain why we had two definitions. And when we found that there was SV40 And when we found that there was DNA plasmids, we knew immediately the reason why there was 2 legal definitions. And then we found evidence that, Pfizer actually took some of the molecular tools on purpose so that the FDA panel would never see them.
Jack Kruse, standing at the crossroads of truth and suppression, chose a strategic path to expose Big Pharma without succumbing to their traps.
And went down the rabbit hole, and I realized fairly quickly that she was trying to get me to light Big Pharma up, but instead I decided to go a different way. My idea was, what was present in the book, was it possible in reality? And I went back to the medical school library in the town that I was practicing in, and magically I found a pathway that leptin would act with, and that was called the melanocortin pathway. And I started to read some new papers and found out that leptin linked to this. In fact, the target of leptin was the melanocortin pathway in the brainstem. And one thing led to another. Went and probably read, I'd say this started in 2005 and then it went to 2007. Mm-hmm. And I took my family on a trip to Europe, and I was standing at the foot of Michelangelo's statue. Mm-hmm. And that's when the eureka moment came through, where all the things I had read for 18 months actually came together at the foot of the statue. Why? I looked up at David and saw perfection from 500 years ago, and I looked at me and I said, well, I'm not perfect. And as I looked up to look at his behind, a thing of light came down from the cupola, and on the ledge of the cupola, if you've ever been to Florence, there was actually a bird sitting there. Mm-hmm. And it dawned on me right away, this is the KT event. This is the difference. It's light. Light is the whole deal between leptin and melanin. And then very, very quickly, when I got on the plane the next day to go back home on the Delta flight, I actually started to scribble in my quilt document, which is the first document that I ever wrote about this.
Centralized medicine and peer review, complicit pillars of control, will fight tooth and nail to discredit what shakes their gilded foundations. The question is, will we let them?
So one of the gastroenterologists in the hospital told me, he goes, you got to put this stuff out there. He goes, you realize that this is not going to resonate with centralized medicine and peer review, because they're going to try to rip this apart. He goes, you're going to have to come up with a different plan. Prior to that, because like I said, this began for me in 2005. We're now at about 2010, 2011. Early on in the journey, when I realized that the physics of organisms was the key to understanding circadian biology, I went and visited a person who became my mentor. I mean, this is a person that I didn't physically meet, only through his books. And that was Robert O. Becker. And he was at the end of his life. And I sat down with him, and he told me what he faced with the industrial military complex. And when you find a fabulous idea, you think as a scientist or a doctor that people are going to meet, this progress with open arms. And that's actually not the truth. Why? Because the industrial military complex, and it turns out Big Pharma, who are partners in most things, and when you filter them down, they come through pretty much money and control. He just told me, the way in which you do this, you need to be careful. So with that idea in mind, I began to do something that I don't think anybody else prior to me in medicine really did, where you try to educate a swath of people on what really matters and then subtract out the superfluous. Because it turns out most of the things in centralized medicine, most of the things in longevity, they are superfluous. And the thing is, in order to get people to that level, you actually have to teach them what really matters, and then you have to teach them consistency and how to do it over and over and over. The nice thing is with my work, consistency part is not difficult. It doesn't cost a lot of money. Everything that I teach people is kind of free. With the exception is you may have to change the way in which you live your life, the way in which you do your job, the way in which you're a mother, a father, a caretaker, or even a surgeon. Like one of the big changes for me was we used to start our cases 6:30 in the morning. That changed. I didn't start any of my cases till 8:30 after that. Why? Because sunrise is a non-negotiable situation for me.